eras and forms of writings have only and only made annihilation and emancipation seem more true. Thanks, Meena, for having joined us today and agreeing to speak on experiment, expressions, and equality, writings of wit and women. The particular theme merits a stake in SA due to the school's continuing engagement and contribution to the field of expression, whether it be art, cinema, or theatre. The collective attempts towards an egalitarian tradition persistently shape our work here, and I hope continue to do so. I shall now introduce our moderator, Professor Nivedita Menon, is currently professor at the Center for Comparative Politics and Political Theory, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She's the author of Seeing Like a Feminist that came out in 2012. Apart from research papers in Indian and international journals, her previous books are Recovering Subversion, Feminist Politics Beyond the Law, Power and Contestation, India After 1989, et al. She has also edited two volumes on gender and politics in India and sexualities, and also co-edited a book, Critical Studies in Politics, exploring sites, selves, power. She's also a regular commentator in contemporary issues, as we all happen to know, on the collective blog Kafila.online, of which she is also one of the founders, and active in democratic politics in India. She has also translated fiction and non-fiction from Hindi and Malayalam into English, and from Malayalam into Hindi, and received the A.K. Ramanujan Award for Translation instituted by Katha. The famous Saying Like a Feminist has been translated widely into Malayalam, Hindi, Punjabi, Spanish, and an updated second edition is forthcoming this year as well. Thanks, Professor, for having joined us today. We again welcome both of you and we look forward to an afternoon of expressions, experiments, and equality. I also request everybody to kindly keep their masks on during the program. Thanks.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be in a crowded room and to declare COVID finished. No one's wearing a mask, so I hereby declare it gone. But I do request you to wear your masks as far as possible. I will when I'm not speaking. It's an enormous delight and a huge privilege to be a discussant at this lecture by Meena Kandasamy. I've long been an admirer of her work. I may have read almost everything you've written. Inimitable, feisty Miss Militancy herself, right? I mean, this is the title of one of her books, as you know. So the format will be that Meena will speak for about, she says, half an hour to 40 minutes, mostly on her new work. And I'll have a couple of questions for her, and then we want at least half an hour for you and the audience and Meena to engage in discussion. But before we begin, I want to kick off the afternoon with one of Meena's most electrifying poems.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you. आप नहीं होते तो इवेंट ही शुरू नहीं हो रहा था.
कोई बात नहीं.
So I wanted to share with you one of Meena's poems which I find most electrifying. First, let me share with you the incident that inspired it. It was reported in bare words for an international forum by the Tamil Nadu Women's Forum, 2007, well into the second decade of the 21st century in India. This happened in a village school, a school in Tamil Nadu. So this is the way the report puts it. Dhanam, a Dalit girl, lost her eye when she was beaten up by her teacher for taking drinking water directly herself instead of waiting for a non-Dalit to touch the water or to serve her. Simple, one sentence. While Dhanam is left with only one eye, her teacher assaulted her. And this is how Meena memorializes the incident in searing poetry that does not romanticize, does not aesthetize, does not victimize and invisibilize Dhanam into theory. The pot sees just another noisy child. The glass sees an eager and clumsy hand. The water sees a parched throat, parched throat, thirst. But the teacher sees a girl breaking the rule. The doctor sees a medical emergency. The school sees a potential embarrassment, the headline, and the photo feature. Dhanam sees a world torn in half, her left eyelid open but light slapped away, the price for her taste of that touchable quarter. Over to Meena.
Thank you, Mom.
If you call me ma'am,
Thank you, Professor, and thank you all for turning up in such large numbers here. And thank you for hosting me. I'm really, I have to get this out as well. I'm really happy not to be doing another Zoom meeting because there's so much enormous Zoom fatigue, and so it's really so I was asked to speak about expressions, experiment. Equality and the writings of wit and women. I don't think wit writes itself. Women have to write wit also. And I just wanted to. Can you just put the last picture on? So I just wanted to speak about my. Yeah, that one. That's yeah. So I just wanted to speak about my last novel, which is structured a little bit, as you can see, crazily. So there's margins and then there's the text. So that text is the text of the novel, and what's in the margins is the text of my life as I write the novel. And the reason for this is quite interesting. So I have written 2 books of poetry. I've written 3 novels. And the second novel was called When I Hit You, or the portrait of the writer as a young wife. And I spent 3 years writing this book, and I called it a novel. But everybody decided that they know better than the person who actually writes the book itself. Because when you're a woman, you can't decide to which genre your book belongs. So you're like this really helpless kid, So you need to be helped out even after you write, you publish. So people would always call it a memoir. And I was like, if I was writing one, if I was writing, an autobiography, I would know that I was writing an autobiography. You wouldn't have to come and tell me I was writing one. So this felt like extremely invasive of my privacy, but also the fact that this is constantly happening to women all over the world. You write poetry, it's read as a diary. You write a novel, it's read as a story of your life. And in so many ways, we are stand-ins for what we write. And so I wanted to, use this opportunity to speak about, my impulses behind the writing this novel, but also why I would choose to experiment, because this is another question that often comes up. And again, the fact that I'm on a university campus is, I used to teach at Anna University, and people would say, oh, if you're so passionate about social justice, ma'am, you should go and teach in the slums. Why are you teaching here? So the question is always like, if you are so passionate.
Please ask.
We'll continue.
But I think there are a lot of people who want to hear you. Should we go to the auditorium without this?
No, but
I think we'll continue here.
we continue here, please. This slide.
Because otherwise it will get delayed by another half hour.
Thank you.
There's a chair here, Alone. There's a chair here.
ये भी hostage situation है. So the same logic which tells people that if you're fighting and so passionate about social justice, go on teaching the slums, is the same thing which declares to writers, if you're so worried about changing, being a revolutionary in your writing, why do you experiment? Experiment is something that puts off people. And I really wanted to tie up, why it matters to do this as well. So this is something I prepared. I normally don't do this, but yeah, I find JNU intimidating. I also find, the School of Art and Aesthetics next level intimidation, so I will come with a written text. So first I was deeply haunted by how often I had people tell me that my second novel was not a novel. Those things, annoyed as I was, having to constantly disagree. Those who were kinder than that and willing to accept that the narrative followed the genre conventions of the novel took up issue with the broader theme. Is it fiction? It cannot be fiction because it happened to her. The way in which everyone seemed to consume the story, as though they had a ringside view of my entire personal life, seemed to strip me away of any individuality, any privacy, any right to secrets. Besides, that fiction, auto fiction, as I saw my work as, could carry a truth value. The form and frame of a novel allowed me to do justice. My aim of it was the visions of writing out my life did not seem to matter. I did my if I were writing my life as a memoir, I would do it on my own terms and not depict a single violent abusive marriage, as though that were all that happened to me. That autofiction is birthed not just at the moment of writing or as an act of retrospective imagining, and instead has its origins embedded in every single day-to-day decision in the midst of inhabiting a crisis. Something which I, but it was not knowledge that would be just as easily accessible or apparent to others. Having lived a real life that involved obsessive plotting as the escape mechanism, I was in no mood to spend my time justifying genre choices to others, especially those who are in a position to come to terms that autofiction is plotted by choosing to lead one's life along a circuit that has one eye fixed on the narrative arc and resolution that it's serving itself towards. The imagination that's required of literary noblesse is sometimes way out of a bad marriage in a judgmental society, almost as if one's life depended upon it. So, although I had ceased responding to the stamp of memoir being foisted on my work, it had fundamentally altered what I was going to do next. I did not feel satisfied with the idea of telling a story that I had known or writing from a I had lived and made my own. Meena was out of the question, so was India. I wanted to run away from the stamp of autobiography and how viciously it chases us down. It became an obsession to prove to the literary establishment, at least during my third outing, that I was a writer like any of them. I'm not a writer only because horrible things have happened to me or because I came from a place where it's assumed that only horrible things happen. I could make up stories too, as I could make use of my own or ransack history to find one. I wanted to use this opportunity to also probe this fiefdom of fiction, show that stories we think of are not only the creatures of our imaginative powers, but they are transactions of what we see around us. Having resolved to not write my life, I wanted to expose how even the fiction that I was actively fabricating was coming from other sources. So I went ahead with this thought experiment and decided to follow, as you can see, a two-column theme. So
See, they're saying this more and more people are coming in and they're not going to be, they want to move to the auditorium. So I'll have to, I'm not the organizer, I'll have to ask the organizers.
There is no AC in the auditorium. Yeah, but there is no AC in the auditorium.
no, I'm not going anywhere.
Done, 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 done.
मैं कहीं भी नहीं जा रही हूँ यहाँ से मैं मुझे माइग्रेन है मुझे बहुत सारे हेल्थ प्रॉब्लम है एक और इवेंट है इसके बाद नहीं अगर कोई और मैं कुछ नहीं कर सकती I'm very sorry.
Sorry.
It's fine. Sorry, that sounded rude.
Your Miss Militancy.
No, it's not that.
No, you have
It's very difficult
Yeah.
to be in the middle of a text and then to get uprooted. And I'm not doing stand-up comedy. I'm doing this. I went ahead with this thought experiment and decided to do a two-column theme. My transparency was not unlike the before-after pictures of weight loss clinics, cosmetic surgeries, dental implants, and other success stories of intervention. After all, these procedures could be nightmares. I wanted to create the equivalent of a studio space within the pages of a novel. If I were a potter, I would be going, look, here the clay, here the red of the riverbed that I managed to haul home, and see, this is what I've done with it, this is what I'm going to do. As much as it is a conscious letting down of guard, it's also an effort to serve the polite reminder that I would use any story the way I use my own, with a combination of absolute sincerity and utter recklessness. So the structure for my madness and what had become an obsession over the following year was now in place. And how did the constraints, which are so essential to experimental writing, come into play? If I inhabited a life different from mine, there would be no describing or anticipating what would have been my choices. Perhaps I would have stalked a stranger, perhaps I would have stolen his phone book, perhaps I would have been the first South Asian Sufi Khan. My constraints were born out of the obvious, out of the limitations of what my life was at that moment. My constraint was my motherhood. And the next thing I want to talk about is about the guilt that's attached to experimental fiction, or all kinds of experiments. There's the guilt attached to embarking on an experimental literature. How appalling to engage in all this play when the world is on fire, the seas are rising, and hatred is having its hat-trick moment. Will not plain old social realism be the answer to our times, to its over-pathologized anxieties? It's the constant need to reassure myself that my literature can be experimental and it can fail, that I need to feel vindicated for having at least tried. There's another striking experience of while writing this book or trying to talk about it to those whom I think might be interested. Maybe I'm projecting, maybe it's real, but the fact of my motherhood appears entirely incongruous to both the avant-garde fiction I'm attempting and the image of the intensely focused novelist churning out page after page under a deadline and uninterrupted glory. They're right in assuming that I'm not someone with undiluted time that's so fundamental to long-form fiction, but as much as motherhood can be mortifyingly canonized as the closest thing to sainthood, a mother is a literary beast, with the same insatiable hungers, with the same curiosity as the child-free writer. This makes me move closer to the realization that my own quest for reform is not only an intervention into the format of the genre of the novel, but a desperate search for a vehicle of imagination, a weapon that I could deploy even as I find myself parenting a toddler and pregnant with my second child. This pram in the hallway that male writers poo-poo does not just stop with the point about fragmented time. My writing comes from a place where one's own life has to be put on hold, one's dreams and one's to-do list indefinitely deferred. Plot is something to be pursued in the mind-numbing still hours of yet another feed. Having decided to go device-free around a little one, every other phrase is passed into something that I will not forget, something that suits later transcription. Hence, the abundance of adjectives. The stories I pilfer and scavenge from other places become the unreliable anchors to the fiction I'm trying to forge. They become diving boards from which my stories can leap off and drown without a trace. In my diary, I have copied out lines from Sarah Mangusu, lines that I will consult again and again during the months I spent working on this book. And she writes, I used to pursue the usual things, sex, drugs, rough neighborhoods, in order to enjoy the feeling of wasting my life, of tempting danger. Motherhood has finally satisfied that hunger. It's self-obliteration that never stops and that no one notices. I have never felt as helpless and as unindividual as when I was visited by motherhood. I have never been more in control of myself either. These words help me find courage. This is not a book about motherhood, that's an urge that I have battled and resisted, perhaps even shelved for another day. But this is a book whose form is profoundly shaped by my experience with motherhood. In her Paris Review piece on the new books of motherhood and how they form a countercanon, Lauren Elkin makes the point: if literature takes different forms, even down to different approaches to the fragment, it is as a means of getting to grips with all the different forms motherhood can take. So being immersed in being a mother, I do not know what form mine has taken, and the act of making this book is one of the mirrors I had to look at myself as a mother writer. Somewhere in the transparency of this text, I hope that this birthing, this tending to a little child, this motherhood reveals itself to the readers too. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Meena. I actually do have a number of questions about your new book, which I have started reading, and I'm very struck by the format. But let me just maybe first touch upon some of the key themes that you touched upon briefly, and maybe you'd like to say a little bit more about it. So I saw kind of three themes for me that emerged from what you said. One had to do with the way writing is labeled, and you say that women's writing tends to be labeled as an act of power and condescension. I found that a very interesting. So this whole business about genre, who labels the genre, who decides on the mainstreamness of a genre, and so on. So I'd like you to say a little bit more about this labeling and how that has affected your writing or not affected your writing. The second really interesting question for me, and I'd really like you to say a bit more about it, is the guilt you grappled with. I don't think you felt the guilt, but the guilt you're expected to feel for experimenting with form. I think you're suggesting that experimenting. I like the way you made the parallel between being told why are you teaching in university, if you care for social justice you should be teaching in a slum. The parallel question is, why are you experimenting with form? Why aren't you doing social realism in a world on fire? Most of these are terms that you used. So I'd like you to, you mentioned this, but is this a guilt that one should feel? Is this a legitimate guilt? Did you feel it? How did you deal with it, etc.? So why is experimenting with form legitimate in a world on fire? I think you posed the question, so I just wanted, this is not a question I might have posed. I'm drawing it from what you said, so I'm wondering how you dealt with it. And the third obvious question you raise is of motherhood as, I like the way you put it, that this kind of supposed conflict between motherhood and avant-garde writing, as if they're two opposite poles. And the mother, you said, is a literary beast. So
she's also
a literary beast. So I was actually struck by the way you talk of motherhood as a constraint. You use the word constraint, but it's a productive constraint from what you're saying. It's not a constraint that binds you, it seems. I may be wrong, I'd like you to say a little bit more about it. But you're using constraint. I read an interview with you in The Guardian in which you talk about this French form. I hadn't heard of it before, Oulipo. So you use this French, you refer to the French school of Oulipo, and you can tell us more about it, which is a French school of writing in which you deliberately write within certain constraints. I got this from Meena's interview. So maybe you could, so I see, and I think you're also saying that motherhood is that kind of a constraint. So these are the three questions. Maybe you would like to say a little bit more about these, and then I have a specific question about your actual text.
Thanks. So first, the question of labeling is, this is an old, what I'm facing is what I'm facing, but I think it's an old problem. Like, you know, when Kamala Das wrote My Story, and originally I think it was marketed as her story, as autobiography, and then people said she made up a lot of stuff, and then she had to, I think, at some point say, well, it's a novel, you know. So basically, so here she was calling it a story of her life, my story, an autobiography, and then people are like determining the truth value and pushing her into a stage where she's basically bullied into saying that, you know, this is okay. There are parts of it that are fictional, parts of it that are made up, and it's. I think I face the other thing. So I wrote what I think is a work of it. No, it's a novel. And then I get bullied into. So I think this is something that's very common to, you know, women who write. You know, they constantly policed, and it's a policing that happens in. I come across happening to a lot of women writers as well. Recently, I was reading Nandita Devson's poetry, and she says, when you're a women writer, whatever you write is taken as the story of your life. And she says, the readers expect you to parade before them as if you are a prisoner in a jail parading before the warden, you know. So there is this idea that, you know, whatever you write has to be read as you, but also what does that lead? It also leads to a judgment. And all of this is, you know, in a sense, society is voyeuristic. But then what happens is that, you know, there's only a specific amount of time that people can look at you or discuss you. But this is not used to discuss you as a literary person, or your work is literature. It's not used to speak about how does she deal with language, how does she deal with syntax, how does she deal with what's the aesthetics of her work, what's the message. All of this is lost. Just about they just reduce it to the personal. So it doesn't go into art. And for me, that's the quest, isn't it? So we want to say, no, don't look at me. Consider this art, you know, capital A art. Consider this capital L literature. consider this capital P politics, you know. I don't want you talking about me. I want you talking about the things I'm talking about. So it becomes really like, you know, in that sense, it's important to, you know, resist this and to push it to where you want to push it. The second thing in terms of, you know, the guilt that you expected to feel about experiment, yeah, part of it is, you know, see, academics use a lot of jargon. They don't feel guilty about it, right? Because
We do.
but yeah, but in a sense, if you know, the jargon is something that prevents your work from being read by a lot of people, but you still have to use jargon in order to, you know, to navigate what you want to navigate. So I think it's it's slightly similar, because, you know, why do you play with structure? Why wouldn't you tell a simple story? But then this question of structure also starts haunting you, and why do we want a certain structure? Who said this is going to be? Because Sanatan Dharma is a structure, the caste system is a structure. So if we accept, once we start accepting structures, then we are going to go into, like, we have to accept the caste as it's given. Patriarchy is a structure. We have to accept, you know, the father is the head of the family. So I think once we start accepting structures, I think the change has to happen by breaking down structures. It can happen in a novel, it can happen elsewhere. So I think structures in that sense, you know, the breaking with form, the breaking with structure is a different way of thinking, because once you break a structure, you think differently. Or even when you attempt to break a structure, you're trying to say, I'm going to disrupt something, I'm going to disrupt the way what you take from a book. So yeah, I have an allergy towards, you know, oppressive structures, and, you know, the regular format of the novel could be one of them. In terms of, yeah, motherhood as a mother as a literary beast, but also the productive constraint. Um, this, you know, my mom is a very pragmatic woman, and she said to me, if you're having a child, that means you're taking 5 years out of your career, so think about it. And she said 2 children, that means 10 years. So she was not she was not glorifying children at all, and, you know, so and which I always look at myself and I think that's minus one book of my mom, or minus 5 years of my mom's life, because that's how she made me feel, you know. If one child is 5 years, what she's trying to indirectly tell me is, you are 5 years of my career gone. So, but she's a mathematician. She can give numbers to things. I cannot give numbers to these things. But it was really difficult, because, you know, we were parenting alone without help. But also, how do you manage to, you know, I think my first novel took 7 years to write, because I was going to Cleveland money all the time, and, you know, writing, taking notes, reading. But then you don't find time in the same way. But, you know, the fluid time, the liquid time, it just vaporizes. You know, the child has to be fed, the child has to be clothed, the child has to be changed. So you start writing in your head, and then it creates a very different type of fiction, because I remember sentences from this book just like that, you know. Um, Nothing hides disdain better than a marriage. Nothing hides a marriage in shambles better than a well-ordered school-step home. Because each of these sentences is sentences I think when I'm, you know, feeding the child, or, you know, playing with the child, and then come back and write it down. So the book is almost written in these little fragments. So I think for me, was it a constraint? Did I have to write this book at the time? I don't know. I discussed this with my friends. It might be politically incorrect, but it's still what I discussed, right? So she and I are both mothers. We became mothers at the same time. And on the one hand, it's this period when you're feeling absolutely creative, because, you know, uh, at the same time you're playing with this little child, you know, doing some crayons or putting blocks on top of each other, and you feel your brain cells fossilize. You know, it's like in real time you feel them fossilize. So you're like, I mean, I love my children more than anything in the world, but I cannot not say this. And so it also means that you just don't want to. You don't want to be stuck there. So, you know, you want to be with your child, but you also want to be there for yourself. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
No, thank you, Meena. That's extraordinarily brave and courageous thing to say, and it's the very least I have come to expect from you, because I think not enough has been said about the way in which motherhood, as your mother said to you, can be a constraint, not in the productive sense. But would you like to say a little bit more about this French Oulipo? Because that helped me understand what you were saying a bit more.
Oh, about the constraints.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So this is a Oulipo. It's about, so somebody decides, I'm going to write a novel without the letter E, and then it's a constraint he imposes on himself, and then he writes a novel in which the word E does not appear. So in the same way, you know, you could have all kinds of constraints. So one of the obvious constraints of the story was to was to allow the plot to be dictated by what's happening in my life. So I did not foresee the plot. So things would happen, and that I would be like, okay, these are going to be my characters, and then something else would happen in my life, and I'll try to in some way, when this is happening, try to project or think of how this is going to influence the fiction I'm going to write. So it's a little bit of the constraint was, and I think Exquisite Cadavers actually comes from that. It's the French thinker. It's a French game invented by the surrealists, in which you basically fold a piece of paper in three. Somebody draws the head, somebody draws the midsection of the body, somebody draws the legs, and then you reveal it as a beast. So you see what kind of a beast it is. Like nobody knows what was previously drawn. So the story is like you just don't know already what's going to come next. So in this, the constraint, as I said, was motherhood, because I think it was shaped by that kind of time constraint, but also the constraint of uh, sometimes it starts seeping into the fiction I'm trying to create as well. So yeah. Anyway.
No, I really enjoyed and admire the way in which um, so you have a kind of a theoretical skeleton, and unlike a lot of fiction that tries to go with a certain theoretical framework, that fiction tends to be kind of lifeless because you're so concerned with the theoretical framework. But what I find really fascinating in terms of method with Exquisite Cadavers is that you understand the theoretical framework in interviews with Meena. So it's in this interview that I heard, and I hadn't heard of Oulipo. I found it really fascinating. And I love the way in which Meena links the idea of writing. So you see what she's doing here. I'm sorry to interpret you. You're sitting here, and I'm going to interpret you. The author's dead. But what I mean is, I really appreciate the way in which she picks up a French philosophical tradition, like coming out of surrealism, like Exquisite Cadavers, or she picks up Oulipo, uh, and then she brings it to the business of playing with a child and shutting off your mind and giving the child crayons, but at the same time writing sentences in your mind. So this is a constraint. So one kind of constraint is a male constraint, which you place on yourself. And I'm obviously not talking of the physical bodies of men and women here. I hope I don't have to explain that at SAA or in JNU anywhere, except maybe in some places I might have to, but that's a different JNU. But so there's a way in which Meena brings that the idea of the male constraint, where you say you have the world in front of you, you have 26 letters of the alphabet, everything is in your control, and you say, I'm going to apply this constraint on myself. I will write a novel not using the letter E, or something like this. But the constraint that comes out of occupying the social role of woman is not a constraint you take on entirely by yourself. Of course, there's agency. Of course, there's a decision to be a mother. But there's a way in which Meena posits that agency and that constraint in the most, I think, brilliant way, and sort of breaks the masculine notion of Oulipo. So the reason why she says that in the preface to the novel, she says that the experiment was a means of escape, a desperate attempt to use the rules of storytelling to distract myself from an intricate political reality. So what I also found interesting about your novel is that you can actually open it at any page. I found that I could open it at any page and read a snippet from the left-hand side column and come across a thought on Tamil poetics, for example. Let me just read out two bits that I have here. Just give me a second. Yeah. So here, so the pages are like this, right? So every page is like this. So on page 8, on the left-hand side, which is your life, and the right-hand side is the novel. So in Tamil, so suddenly you just open the book and it says in Tamil poetics, each of the landscapes corresponds to one inner universe. Mountains are associated with the lovers' meeting, forests with waiting. My iPad is. Sorry. Mountains are associated with the lovers' meeting, forests with waiting, and seashores with
Pining.
and seashores with pining. That is where I plan to transport my characters. For this exterior scene, I write, etc. So you have these thoughts on the left, and then then you come to another page where she describes love. So the part which she said I remember, which she quoted, I remembered that too. My iPad is behaving like there's a ghost in it, and it's like this. But on page 9, you do this lovely, amazing description of love, which is on the right-hand side, which is the novel. Page 10. Page 10. Sorry, would you have another version of this? Okay. Maya knows Kareem, knows the love he sends her way. A love, a confused, restrained love, a smoke dust smarting, lullaby soothing love, devoid of melodrama, boring as backdrops. Okay, so this is what this book is. You just go through it, you open it on any page, there is some reflection of Meena's own thoughts, and on somewhere else the story is carrying on its own. And I found it. I have a feeling I could read it backwards, and it would be still a kind of narrative. It's a brilliant, brilliant form. So, if you'd like to add anything more now, and then we can open it up to the audience.
I just possibly read a little bit.
That would be lovely. Thank you.
So this is at the second chapter. I'm going to read left-hand side margins. I can't project from right here, no? Can I? No, I don't have that. It's fine. As soon as I put my characters within a couple and together in the same home, I regret my decision. Enclosed spaces call for quarrels. I feel a sudden urge to push them outdoors. Then the second thing, in Tamil poetics, each of the landscapes corresponds to one inner universe. Mountains are associated with the lovers' meeting, forests with baiting, and seashores with pining. That's where I plan to transport my characters. For this exterior scene, I write sentences burgeoning with a wet bleakness. And so here I'm writing, I decided that they are going to be in a seashore or, in this sea landscape. So the dullness of the landscape lends to their despair. The cold sea, in a hunger to dissolve everything, even and especially marriages, seasons their wounded, bleeding hearts with the sting of her unforgiving salt. Waves, drained of energy, expend the last of their life force in hurtling towards the shore and spreading themselves into inconsequence on the gravelly beach. Life grows more intricate under this heavy greyness. It rains with a vengeance, the sky an angry spouse keeping score. The seagulls sound needy, quarrelsome, crying for pain relief. The promenade is deserted, shops have been shut until the next tourist season. Life is halted, everything is pared down. So austere, this artistry of monotone, this absence of performance, this impromptu penance for their problems. So this is also where, I think here also, as you can see, this is, I think, for the next page where, things are happening. Can you open some other page possibly, Adhika? Yeah, the first one maybe. No, the previous one is better. No, go to the first one. The other one. Sorry, the first one. Yeah, this is very nice. This is about children and so this is also what happens when you're trying to write fiction, and this is people talk about Philip Roth and also on the left hand side, Cedric, my partner's name. Cedric is teaching the toddler to build a Duplo train. Given the color coordinated complex nature of the construction, I suspect he's at play himself. The relaxed look on his face is a godsend, so I explain to him what I'm working on. He seems intrigued. He likes the experimental nature of it. It sounds completely mad, but it's completely you, he says. See, he's charming. I show him parts that I have written. It's literally just the first 2 pages of this book. You have written about us. I have written only very nice things. But you swore several times that you would never do it. He's saying that with a smile. As much as I feel forgiven, I also feel like some kind of Philip Roth. Selfish and exposed. In our couple, we default to exaggerations. We are artistic that way. Goebbels, he says, wagging a finger. Bubbles, our little son repeats, focusing intensely on his index finger, willing it to wag itself. So this is an actual scene from my life, and my partner's first reaction when he knows I'm writing this, because he was like, "Oh, you're writing about us," and then but now this is what's happening in the story of the characters. So I don't know if I should read this, but just for um, with the relationship on an operating table, transaction replaces trust. Pass me the scalpel, please. To save themselves from this oppressive atmosphere, and because suggesting sex would come across as a ridiculously selfish proposal, Kareem attempts an altruistic distraction. Could we have a child? It comes out clumsily. Do you think the introduction of a screaming infant can diffuse the tension between us? It's unfair to the child, unfair to us. That would be catastrophic. More emphatic is Maya's passive aggressive citizen of the world sneer. Maybe this is what they do where you come from. Just don't pull these tricks on me. Another barricade. He doesn't bite the bait, brushes the provocation away. Avoiding confrontation with his wife is an energy saving measure, a kindness to the planet, ranking in the same league as rooftop solar panels and 4-minute rapid showers. So, yeah.
I'll open it up
Please.
for
We
questions.
close,
Would you like to say
No.
two at a time? No, or one question?
Yeah,
at a time?
we'll take some questions together. Yeah.
Okay. Uma?
Thank you, Meena. My name is Uma Khan. Maybe you receive my emails. We haven't met before, that's why I'm giving my introduction.
Several times a day.
My question is very small.
Mhm.
Maybe it will take you to answer it in a longer way. See, you said you are experimenting, right? But in your experimental framework, how do you strike a balance between the lived experiences of your subject and the creative or the imaginative world of the writer? How do you strike a balance? Thank you.
I got the first part. Lived experience of your subject
And the creative, of the writer. The creative. Second question. I thought there were many hands up. Who else had a hand up? Just speak loudly and take Amila will take your mask off to speak. Tell your name. Please identify yourself.
I'm Prabhi. Did you choose to use the meta narrative so that you can evade labeling? Because experimental postmodern texts, they usually can't be labeled. When you try to label them, they fall within much better genres. And we also think that defining the thought process gives the panorama of the label you put in as a writer. So it's like justifying to the someone literature world or mass literature, see this is the amount of labor that goes in. It's not just a personal narrative, and it also gives like a perspective of your wider worldview. That's
Okay, we can take one more question. Yeah, I can see you. Yeah.
um, I'm Soumya. So regarding what you were saying about labeling and guilt, do you think this guilt which comes up or this confusion which comes up with regarding to different labels being attributed is a product because patriarchy or men for that matter of fact, they do not just police our existence, they also police our resistance. So they have very specific ideas of how we should resist, in what way we should resist, and what things are acceptable. So when we talk about your novel being labeled as a memoir, so their idea that whatever thought or whatever expression is going into that novel has to be a reflection of your trauma, and whatever agency you use when you write that novel, it must be a reflection of the trauma which is a product of then patriarchy or of men attacking their rights. So do you think this is something which happens as a writer, or just or even when you talk about this guilt which comes up with social reason, the fact that patriarchy or men determine the ways in which we can resist that. If you write this or if you say this is acceptable and this is okay for you to say. But if you write it in a different way, that's not okay because you are going beyond what we think is acceptable to resist.
We take three at a time.
Yeah, I'm going to start from your question actually. It's very interesting. So the idea is that, see, actually people would be very happy if women don't write at all, or all the marginalized don't write at all. So it's not about what you write. What you write is when they start the first barricade. I mean, it applies for women. It applies for Bahujans, Dalits, Adivasis, minorities. People who are trying to write against the stream. I think people would rather have you not write. And if you happen to write, they would rather have you not read. So you don't get the same access. Newspaper columns. You don't get the same media attention. And also they're very clever. They give you media attention about random things. Come and talk about wives beating. They won't ask you to talk about literature. So it gives you like what kind of media attention you get is also something. Sometimes Vijay TV calls me to talk about makeup, and then I still turn up because I say we are looking for a beautiful society. In the same way, we want to also look beautiful. So it's all we still want to use the little framework to make some social point, but it doesn't matter because that's the level in which they reduce you. Not I think makeup is also revolutionary if you want it to be revolutionary. It depends on motive. But the thing is, here when you use the word guilt, there are two aspects in which I want to unpack it. One is we always talk about confessional poetry, but the idea of the word confessional comes from the idea that you're sinning, because confession is something that comes out of sin. The Christian tradition of you do a sin and therefore you go and confess to somebody. But for me, I live in a universe in which I don't believe that anything I have done is sinful, because your structures are sinful. If your structures are judging me for who I am, then your problem is your fucked up structures. So I cannot look at myself as a sinner or sinful person, and therefore my writing is confessional. My writing is my writing. My writing is what I want to say. So I think that guilt comes because of these ways of framing, the way of calling something confessional, because it comes from this assumption that this is good and this is bad. So I don't want to go into that universe. The second thing is also this issue of trauma. A lot of people are like, again, when they approach this kind of work, they come to me like, I'm really like, when you write about a bad marriage, people look at you like you're a very battered wife needing somebody to call a number and get you some help. So people are like, how was it? Was it cathartic for you? As if I'm going to discuss that with you whom I just met 2 minutes ago. So the question is that, did you write it out of catharsis? What is your trauma? And all these trauma theories. And my question, and then I realize I'm always happy. These are PhD topics, huh? So you cannot evade these questions also. They're doing real research on you. So respect, deep respect. Of all the things they could do with their lives, they want to research me. So when they talk about trauma, I say to them that again the problem is the novel is seen as a text of the individual. That's how the novel is seen, in terms of the story or whatever it is. The 18th century invention of the novel itself makes it a vehicle of individual thought, individual experience. But I believe much more in the collective. So my first novel is about the Kilbenmany massacre, about 44 people who were burned to death because they were striking for higher wages. And then I only can ask you a counter question. Don't you think it was far more traumatic for me to write about 44 people being burnt to death because of their belief in their rights? Then what happened to me, and me writing a novel about domestic violence which happens to a lot of women? So why do you think that something that happens to me affects me more than what happens to another person? Because that's also how we are taught to think. Individual experience apparently should pain us more than collective oppression. It doesn't. For me, I think Gypsy Goddess is far more traumatic. Will wake me up at night and make me rage more than anything that can physically happen to me or has happened to me. So I think this is again how trauma, but what trauma? What are we going to do about the fact that we are collectively traumatizing people through the caste system, through patriarchy, things like that. The second question of meta narrative and experimental postmodern work is that I personally think it can coexist with social realism, or like for instance my first novel again, I used a framework in which the fact that I'm the writer is very visible. It was very annoying for a lot of people, but that's fine. I was happy. I was tripping. I was really happy, so I don't mind. But yeah, so the thing is that sometimes you have to show, the author is also not some superpower. They are coming into a story, they are coming into it, battling so many things, but also, um, and this is again speaks back to some of what Professor was earlier talking about, and also what I've been hearing, is that when you're a writer from writing about one the subject, but also yourself. You constantly have to theorize yourself. Because if you don't do your theory, somebody else is going to do it in a very different way, in a way in which you don't accept or understand or endorse. And so constantly having to not just write but place your work within a tradition or anti-tradition, place your work within form or against form, place your work in the political context. So you write, and but you also are the one looking at your own work, because if you it seems such an important political task to do, because there are not many people who are going to read you with the same sympathy, but also not going to read you with the same allegiance to to revolution or to in solidarity. So when that kind of solidarity you cannot know that it exists for sure, then you have to fill the gap yourself, which makes your writing itself complicated, because you're both writing and theorizing in your own writing. uh, s- uh, so your question about
The balance.
I will meditate about it, because the lived experience of my subject and the creative world of the writer, how do I balance? Um, I think that as much as possible, I try to, when I write about issues, I try to disappear as much as possible. So, and that's also why fiction is not the only work I do. I do a lot of non-fiction as well. So, my last book was about the female. The women tigers in the LTT. So 1/3 of the LTT was full of women, and I was later listening to the stories, what happened post genocide, and so these are stories where you have to remove yourself. So it's not, you're not bringing your creativity and saying, oh, I can write a beautiful sentence. You're not saying, I'm doing this, but it's so important to stand back and let them speak. So that's where, but also I think the creative, when I was very young, I think, I don't know what is young, but yeah, around 18 or 19, I had this line scribbled in my diary. It's something from Tony Kate Bambara, who said, the role of the radical artist is to make the revolution irresistible. And I really believe that. So I think the creative writer's job is to, as much as you respect the lived experience, to make it the most striking, make it the most appealing, but most arresting, because you want somebody's, I think we live in a world where people's attention spans are so diffuse that you have to still do something for them to read what you have to write or what you have to say. So I think that's where the writer's responsibility comes from. There's ethical and other responsibilities, but also just to draw somebody in, but keep them there with the text. So I think this is how I marry them.
Thanks. Actually, I was thinking of the poem that I read out to you, Meena's poem on Dhanam. So it's actually a direct, I would use that poem to answer your question, because what Meena does with the, she makes, sorry, go on.
No, please, sorry.
No, please.
No.
It's, they want to hear what you.
No, no,
I'm
no.
just going to
No.
ventriloquize you
No,
for a moment.
that's fine.
That the way I saw what Meena did in the poem is she uses this active act of seeing, and she continues to apply it to Dhanam. So Dhanam also sees, the pot sees, the well sees, the teacher sees, etc. But Dhanam also sees. So I thought your question was interesting, because I suddenly remembered the way in which she places Dhanam at the center, despite Dhanam being the victim. So I thought that was interesting. And I really like the way you answered that question. It's a complicated question and a complex answer. There are some more questions. Everyone will have to hear, so please stand up and maybe remove your mask while you speak.
My name is Shaurya. I'm from Secret Mode. So what you just now said really interested me. That what you write is going to be seen as affecting you more, rather to the society. It should be seen. So also, like I am a person with disability, but people only see that I should be writing about disability related issue, and that is where the focus should be. And I also try to contextualize it, like why do people only see, like I should be only seeing disability issue and no other issue. So even like people are also seeing the context in which I am driven, and that is where the judgment of people seeing me as writing from my own individual context comes from, or is it the structure which has been created? Like my context is also part of my structure, which leads people to see my story in a certain way, and I hope I'm able to
Yeah.
articulate.
Yes, thank you. We'll just take the next question.
Hi, I'm Manya, and my question is actually.
Bend little bit.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
So my question is actually rather simple. So when you were writing, did you also see reflections of, since you talked about motherhood being literary based, did you also see reflections of your own mother in the text itself? Maybe in retrospect or in the moment.
We can take one more question. Yeah.
I had a question. I mean, you mentioned that experimenting when the world is on fire, right? So art as resistance is something that has been used by marginalized groups, if you consider race or caste. So if someone has to fictionalize their own oppression and write it in a fictitious form, how exactly do they ensure that there is a certain demarcation? Like, for example, if someone's writing about the caste oppression they might have faced based upon it, and they create a fictitious story, how do they ensure that it's not labeled, as you said, an autobiography? And they constantly ensure that, it's a fictitious account, but it's inspired from living. So how do you ensure that demarcation? And how do you ensure that you do not end up making it an autobiography yourself? Because sometimes you tend to get carried away. I think that's it.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the first question. In terms of people placing you within context, I hear you and I understand what you're saying. Um, but this is a part of this approach is the stay in your own lane approach. So this is the approach that says you cannot write anything beyond what has happened to you. And this is often also used the other way, in which somebody who writes about something that has not happened to them is said, don't appropriate. The other context is, it's not your own experience. This is not your story. This is not your struggle. You don't talk about this. So there is, this is also very political. People say that, and at the same time, there's also only speak about what has happened to you. The first thing is that this is basically thought policing. This is thought policy. Nobody can say somebody what to think, what not to think, what to write, what not to write, because that curtails your freedom of expression. How you receive it is your problem. But I think people have a fundamental right to write. So you can have the right to write about anything under the sky. But I also think that when we discuss this in India, it becomes very touchy because people are like, can Savarnas write about caste? The thing is, they have not been writing about caste. They've been they've been hiding all the oppression they have been doing. So the question that's a moot question. But when we come look at the, as an experience of an immigrant, then you understand that if you're in India and you want to write about rent control in the UK or the housing crisis in the UK, or you're very interested with what Corbyn is doing and you want to see, how is it affecting. But then people again are not interested in you to, as an immigrant to comment on the broader issues. They're saying, okay, write something about the Desi diaspora or write something about where you are from. So constantly you're being told to get into your little box. But the main thing, and this can happen everywhere. Like I write about the Tamil Tigers, but I don't think any single Tamil nationalist man who supports the Tigers is happy that a woman is writing because one third of the fighting force was women, so women were dying. But when a woman is writing, it makes them, especially Tamil Nadu, public intellectuals I'm speaking about. Like women were dying, but it's not in. Why is women commenting about this? This is so masculine. Struggle is so masculine. Taking arms, but women were dying. Women were taking arms. So the whole idea is that this intellectual space is one of the spaces which is very actively, rabidly, outrageously, shamefully guarded. Nobody wants, and that's part of it comes from the caste system. They don't want anybody except a Brahmin to be a thinker, and especially a Brahmin man to be a thinker. So if you're a woman, they're going to tell you your way out. And if you happen to be Shudra and woman, Dalit and woman, Adivasi and woman, no, you cannot claim that space. And I think the same. I would again go back to the caste system because you look at the texts like the Kama Sutra, texts like the Manusmriti, they're extremely anti-disabled text. So this idea of keeping people with disabilities outside, or keeping them from the core normative of the society itself, is very embedded in the grammar of these texts. Like the Tamil Tolgapiyam, I'm sorry to detour into grammar, talks about 7 types of love. And five of these types is all the landscapes I spoke about. No, pining, coming together, parting, first relationship in the first meeting, whatever. But there are two relationships that is mentioned in the Tolkappiyam. One is mismatched love. So mismatched love is age gap relationships. I'm not going to talk about in jail. Everybody's going to say about power and abuse and nobody's going to speak about the women's agency. But yeah, so the one is age gap relationships, but also relationships between the poor and the the rich, stuff like that. Big gaps. But then the other type of love that's also outlawed, I think it's called kaikilai in Tamil, is the love of a disabled person, as if writing love to a disabled person is not part of grammar. And then you look at they have so many poems have survived. Let us say 2,000 poems have survived, but there are hardly 7 or 8 poems that talk about somebody who is disabled as in love. So already the basic underlying grammar of the text itself has been an anti-disabled text. So this is where we have to, come from. So it's true that this is happening today, but I also want us to understand all of this from historicity and the perspective of how long this has been going on. I don't know if I answered your question, but I've tried to think alongside you and try to reflect. So don't let anybody tell you what you should or should not write. That's my answer. In terms of my mother, I think my guide once told me that our mothers are sitting on our beds, Meena. This was my PhD guide. So my mother doesn't have such an omnipresence, but she does have a presence. I don't know if that answers anyway. Yeah. And
Art as resistance and
yes, art is resistance and
fictionalizing.
fictionalizing. So here I'm going to again, slightly give you adjacent answers. So it's not an answer to you, but something similar, which is Anand Teltunde once, did an interview in which he was talking about text, and he was saying, why are Dalit autobiographies selling in these large numbers? And he said that part of it is because liberals are consuming them for feel good. So they consume this. No. They consume this and they feel good about themselves. It may talk about very extreme things, They may talk about not getting food. It may talk about exploitation, harassment. But they will say, I'm such a good person because I'm reading a Dalit text. So it validates you. It makes you a compassionate person. So he said that's why these books are being sold in large numbers as opposed to resistance stories. So if we are writing from, let us say, a personal standpoint, something happened, caste happened, cruelty happened. The main issue is to make it a resistance text. For me, Kill One Money is not about 44 people being killed, because that story is the story of landlords doing. But the fact that people resisted, the fact that for me it's a militant story. It's a militant story of how powerful people were willing to even pay with their lives. So as long as you make it a resistance narrative and you stand with the people, and you write, I think much more in a collective way. I think that can subvert. This people cannot consume a book like a book that is a resistance text in the same way as a text with as a feel good text, because then they would have to pick sides and stuff. Again, I hope I answered you. Thank you.
More questions? Yeah.
I'm going to intertwine two aspects of the lecture that we're talking about. So when we were talking about the conception of the structure and form, and then we talked about Sanatana Dharma also as one kind of structure, and then when we were talking about the concept of motherhood as some kind of productive constraint. So ma'am, if we try to contextualize or if we want to see motherhood as a productive constraint,
That was ma'am's words.
Yeah. Nivedita's so they were Nivedita's words was the productive constraint is my word, but
Motherhood as a constraint is my word.
but motherhood as a constraint is what Meena's been saying.
we're also talking about male constraint also.
Male constraint also. I did not call the form male or female. I sleep with everything,
I'm
everyone.
not only intertwining both.
So male and female don't exist for me. No. I don't think in binary. No. No. Like, yeah.
So your question is intelligent.
Did you say?
The aspects of both you also.
Oh.
What I'm saying,
Mm.
when you are talking about constraint,
Mm.
when you are talking about the structure and form,
Mm.
and talking about Sanatana Dharma also as a structure. So how will you actually conceptualize the conception of constraint itself within Sanatana Dharma? And if you see it from the lens of the kind of dichotomy of the structure and form that we were talking about. So if you
intertwine these concepts, then where does the term constraint comes in the conception of structure and form?
Constraint comes from endogamy. Like endogamy is a constraint. That's what keeps the structure alive. You know, the structure of Sanatan Dharma is kept alive by the constraint of endogamy. You marry only within your caste. So the constraint is what holds up the structure. Without this constraint, the structure will collapse. If everybody is marrying everywhere, how will the system exist? You know. So constraint is what holds up the structure. That's how I think I would answer in terms of Sanatan Dharma. Thank you.
Yeah.
So that is a simple question, and purely from a reader's perspective. You said that this is an experiment. This method is an experimental method. So as a reader, when I start reading, I have the left portion and the right portion, and so somewhere I might have to juggle between narratives, and I have a text span, I have a focus span. I might have to juggle between two narratives, right? So how would you respond to such a feedback from a reader? Also, likewise, did you have any apprehensions of your own while doing this experiment?
So I will try to answer you. You know, I've got this haircut a few days ago, announcing it. And then I always think that, you know, when people say that somebody looks beautiful or assume that, you know, they're looking well dressed, then I always think that it's the work of many hands. Because, you know, nobody is just born, like, you know, nobody's just born with all of this. Whether your hair is straight, whether it's cut, whether, you know, you're wearing a lipstick. So it's the work of many hands. And only a many hand can make like the clothes, right, from every aspect of this. And I think a text is also a text like that. So this is the text that the author writes, but the text comes alive because of the reader. It comes alive because what the reader imagines, because of what the reader feels, because of what the reader remembers. And so for me, the text is, you know, it is a very, it can be one person writing, but I think the moment of its coming alive is when the reader reads it, you know. So whether you read it carefully, carelessly, whether you use the pages as bookmarks, or, you know, whether you read it with a short Twitter attention span. I'm on Twitter all the time, so I know very well about attention spans. So yeah, so however you read it, I think you are making the text, you know. So for me, it's it's in the reader's hands. Though. Is there another question that I missed?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
So in one of the narratives that was given here, it's like I think Cedric says, "Oh, you promised to never write about us."
Mm-hmm.
So I think that struck me in a way that marginalized people or when people from communities who have never been able to reach these power dynamics, they are expected to visualize their existence, but also there's a line where you are also expected to like give up your privacy. Like as a queer individual, having to out your communities and your like the very very social codes that your communities practice to present it to a heterosexual audience. So where do you draw the lines between visibilizing your communities and lived experiences of underspoken groups, as well as preserving this autonomy and agency of these groups to coexist within a large narrative to ensure that their spaces remain like separate and remain autonomous?
Could you just see if there are a few?
Yeah, please.
And are there, if there are any, we can take two more in this round. Okay, no, very good.
Okay, the last. So yeah, I think this. I think it is a price you have to pay. It's an unfortunate price. It shouldn't be the way things are. I remember my parents entered this anti-caste, inter-caste marriage in the 80s. You know, my mom was 31 at the time. My father he comes from a nomadic tribe. She's a Shudra. And I remember growing up that caste was never mentioned by these people because they got cut away from both families. My father had migrated to Chennai. And all their friends were, you know, radicals. They were Periyaris, they were Tamil Tiger supporters, and later on growing up, there was Dalit Panthers. But the thing is, and my mom and my father were very important people. My mom went to court against the IIT Madras in '96. You know, 5 years after the Mandal Commission came, saying that you must implement reservation for faculty because you know I'm a Shudra woman and I'm being overlooked. So she went to court. So all this was happening, you know, around me. But as much as they were well respected within their communities, they were not public, you know. But when I became unfortunately public, then I had to, for the first time in my life, reveal my parents' caste. Because people are like, who are you? why are you speaking about this? What's your caste background? Because if you don't answer it, people will then give you other backgrounds. Let's say she comes from an oppressive community that was burning somebody's hut. And then you have to go back and answer. Or they would say, what is she making it up? So then you have to say, okay, my father is from this thing. And it felt so shameful. And believe me that, I felt worse than I was feeling when I was raped. Because you have to say, my father comes from a nomadic community that was, have to beg for a living. And, this is the name of the community, Andi Pandaram. Pandaram still is a slur word in Malayalam. Why did I have to say this? And this was the price because my father got away until he was 50, 55, until he is 70 without having to disclose his caste. Like my mother could say she was an OBC, go to court. She didn't have to disclose her caste. It was her right under the constitution to ask for her rights. She didn't have to disclose her caste. My father did not have to disclose his nomadic tribal status. He did not have to disclose what it entails to be a Pandaram in a society. But the minute people put you on this, then you're in a fix. You cannot say I will not answer because that is arrogance. And you know that this comes from a difficult place where even if you have to be so vulnerable and expose what you are. And for me, the question again was, if it was just me, I could say whatever I am, whatever I am not. But I had to expose this caste is not given to me, right? This is a caste given to my parents. And this is something they have spent ages not disclosing. But because I was in the public eye, I had to disclose it. And they felt violated. My father said, I've had friends for 40, 50 years. They've never asked me my caste. And now you are going to write about it on Facebook just to get out of a problem because people are accusing you. But then I was like, what would I do? I have to get out of this so that I can continue speaking. At the same time, I cannot imagine how violated they felt about me going public. And this is the truth. I think in order for you to be in a public place, you have to expose your near and dearest ones because you have to say where you are from and what happened. So I don't know how to marry this because it is cruel. In fact, your parents love you. They bring you up so that you protect them, so that you take care of them, so that you love them. They don't bring you out into the world so that you go around talking about their caste, right? And then their caste is not my caste. Like, I don't know, I'm married to a Belgian, I have 2 children, they happen to be British and American. Like, what caste can I give my children? Like, people would force you to say something, but I'm like, all of this caste genealogy research, aap kar do. It's not my job because and my life is getting more and more complicated. So this is what I feel like. Sometimes, in order to validate our presence, validate our voice, validate where we are coming from, we are asked to share the most intimate details of our lives. But this is the price you pay in the bargain because not answering would be complicit. You would be complicit in oppression. So sometimes you have to share this. I think.
So you have translated works of Thiruman, you have also translated various works. And my question is, we have seen a literary movement from an anti-caste literary movement in India, that is from Panthers. And literature, like stories and works written by Mahatma Phule has not revolutionary value, but still are untranslated. Most of them are mostly untranslated. And whatever works of period Panthers and Mahatma Phule is translated doesn't have much of market circulation also. It has very less market value. So after
Go to LibGen. If you don't find uprooting Mitra, go to LibGen, download it. And that's my career is also on LibGen now. I think the other website is b-ok.asia. Please download these books. And I'm very much a writer who advocates piracy.
How do you think I have your How do you think I have your books?
Yeah, please. That's the way we reach. Yeah, that's the way we reach.
Yeah, but
Sorry.
mostly like Fuller's works you'll find untranslated. Many of his colleagues' works like on Fuller are untranslated. So after all these years, like we have a lot of scholars and writers from the community, but still like we face the problem in classic literature, like reading and accessing, translating the classic literature. So my question is very simple: what is to be done? Like we have a lot of scholars, a lot of books have come, but still the classic literatures are there untranslated. What is to be done?
Translation.
That's very easy. Like, we all have been
No, but there is a lot of gatekeeping. This is something I want to say. And I feel that Tirumavalavan faces this problem a lot. Because he happens to be Dalit, people don't think that he has something to say on Palestine. They think that he doesn't have anything to say on Kashmir. They think he doesn't have something to say on 370. He doesn't have something to say on 377. So the thing is, he has to stay in the box. So they are not interested in what he has to say about Indian nationalism, cooperative federalism, parliamentary democracy. So I think when I actually started this translation, I was 17 or 18 at the time, and I was thinking that I was consuming material exclusively in English, and I felt all of these viewpoints we are not reading in English. We are reading what possibly JNU, Cambridge, Oxford Valley type write in English op-eds. We don't write what people on the street are fighting against, especially people in Tamil Nadu. So I decided that I'm going to translate this work into English, in order to disrupt this English. Not that I managed to do any disruption, but managed to try to do a disruption in what is consumed in English. So this was very revolutionary text for me, both Talisman and Approach Hindutva. And imagine, see, in any other country, there was no caste system. Somebody says Uproot Hindutva, calls the title of his book Uproot Hindutva, way back in 2004. And now this menace is all over our country. We would all be talking about this book. If this person was not a Dalit, if he was a Savarna, everybody would be reading this like the Communist Manifesto. What does he say about Uproot Hindutva? What does Ambedkar say about Uproot Hindutva? But the fact is, just because of somebody's social location, we don't consider them intellectuals. This is what I previously said. You have to be a Brahmin to be considered an intellectual in India. And recently, this was strangely coming from Kalyan Raman, who is himself a Brahmin translator. He said he read this book called Greatest Short Stories in Tamil, and he said 28 of the translators were all Brahmins. And this is like a small community in Tamil Nadu, but there's active gatekeeping. So how do you fight against gatekeeping? I think we have to train ourselves as translators. So when I started translating, I had the misfortune of going to a Kendriya Vidyalaya, so I learned only Hindi and English at school. So my mother tongue was Tamil. And I was translating from Tamil because I knew this as a native language, but I was not equipped in this language. So, but I still did it. I did not say, okay, I didn't go to 12 years of Tamil school, therefore I'm going to be hold back. Because if I don't do it, I don't think anybody else would have done it. They would have done it later on, but it was an urgent text, it had to be urgently translated. So this is where I come from. I think we need to popularize our ideas, and we also need to use English to popularize our ideas, I think.
Just let me add. As far as translations of Fule or other variety things are concerned, which I am aware, there is also viciousness that goes in the translation. Say, for example, when Baby Kamra's book has been translated, the last part, which doesn't exist in Marathi, it exists in English. I mean, how it came, we don't know. It's our translator's choice that has come. Those who understand Marathi as well as English can easily make out. But those people who cannot understand Marathi and read only English text and then start believing that it is an authentic translation. Another is G.P. Deshpande's translation of Fule. Obnoxious translation, I would say. Absolute obnoxious translation.
I blurred the book.
So you have these kind of translations available these days, and even the some of the texts that get translated. Say, for example, I give you a classic example when it comes to Hindi translation. Say, for example, Dr. Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste, which was translated in Hindi by L.R. Bali, or Dr. Ambedkar's Buddha and his Dhamma, which has been translated in Hindi. Very subtle translation by Ananda Kausalyan does not kill the spirit of the text, and neither it goes into any kind of its own ideas or anything, except that word dharma. He constantly uses that word dharma, whereas Ambedkar uses the word dhamma. Except that anomaly, the translations are very good.